They forced him to spill the water at her feet, and by nightfall the same ground would tremble under hooves no man in that town had the courage to count. The sun hung low over Red Hollow, heavy and slow like it didn't want to witness what came next, casting long shadows across the dry street where Elias Whitaker stood beside a splintered trough, his hand still wrapped around a worn leather canteen that had seen more miles than most men in that town could imagine, the kind of canteen passed down, patched, and kept not for its worth, but for what it had carried through years of dust and silence. And at his feet lay a woman who did not belong to this place, her dark hair tangled with grit, her breathing shallow but steady, the faint scent of sage and smoke clinging to her clothes in a way that didn't belong to the wooden buildings and iron nails of Red Hollow. And for a moment the world felt still, like even the wind had paused to see what choice a man like Elias would make when no one was watching. Except someone always was. He had seen her from a distance first, just a figure swaying against the heat rising off the ground like a mirage that refused to fade, and he could have walked past, could have told himself it wasn't his concern, that nothing good ever came from stepping into trouble that wore a different language and a different history. But something older than reason moved his hand before his thoughts could catch up, and he had unscrewed the cap, stepped closer, and held out the water without a word, not as an offering, not as a statement, just as something simple in a place where simple things had long been forgotten. And when she looked up at him, her eyes didn't show fear the way he expected. They showed recognition, not of him, but of the choice itself, as if she had seen men fail it before. The first voice came from behind, sharp and certain, cutting through the quiet like a blade drawn slow, followed by boots on wood, the creak of doors, the low murmur of men who had nothing better to do than decide what kind of justice fit the hour. And Elias didn't turn right away, didn't rush, just stood there. With the canteen still extended, the sun catching the worn leather in a dull glow, until the woman reached for it with hands that trembled not from fear, but from something closer to exhaustion. And the moment her fingers brushed the canteen, the town decided it had seen enough. You know what she is, someone said, not asking, never asking, because questions required doubt and Red Hollow had none left. And Elias finally turned, slow and steady, meeting faces he had known for years but never truly seen, faces that now looked at him like he had stepped out of line in a way that needed correcting. And he could feel it then, not anger, not yet, but the shift, the quiet agreement passing between them like a contract no one had to sign. And still he said nothing, because out here words didn't fix anything. They just gave men something to hide behind. A hand reached for the canteen, rough and quick, and before Elias could move, or maybe before he chose not to, it was torn from his grip, the leather dark against the dust for a split second before the water spilled out, soaking into the dry earth at the woman's knees, disappearing almost instantly like it had never existed at all, and the sound of it, soft as it was, seemed louder than anything that had happened that day, because everyone heard what it meant. Elias looked down at the empty canteen now lying in the dirt, then at the woman, then back at the men who stood waiting for him to understand something they believed was obvious. And for a long moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the choice had already been made, and it wasn't theirs anymore. No one bent down to pick up the canteen, not at first, because in Red Hollow even small objects carried meaning once they touched the ground in front of witnesses, and Elias could feel their eyes on him, waiting for something, a protest, an apology, a sign that he understood the rules he had just stepped across. But he did not move right away, did not rush to defend himself or explain what did not need explaining. He simply stood there with the same stillness that had kept him alive through years of quiet work and quieter mistakes. And when he finally crouched, it was not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, like a man finishing something he had already decided long before this moment arrived, his fingers brushing the dust from the leather, turning the canteen over once in his hand, as if checking whether it still held any purpose at all. And then he rose again, slower this time, facing them without lifting his chin, without lowering it either, just level, as though the ground beneath them all was the only thing that mattered. "You going to say something, Elias?" one of them asked, voice edged with something that sounded like authority, but carried the weight of borrowed confidence. And a few others shifted closer, boots pressing lines into the dirt that would be gone by morning, but the memory of them would not. not for the ones who understood what lines meant out here. And Elias looked past them instead of at them, his gaze drifting for a brief second toward the open land beyond the last building, where the horizon stretched wide and empty, the way it always had, the way it always would. And when he spoke, it came out low and even, not meant to convince, not meant to challenge, just meant to exist. She needed water. That was all. No defense, no argument, no attempt to soften the edges of what had already been done. And for a moment that answer hung there heavier than any accusation they could have thrown at him, because it left no room for them to twist it into something else, and that made it worse. A few of them laughed then, not because it was funny, but because laughter filled the space where uncertainty tried to settle, and one man nudged the empty canteen with the toe of his boot, as if testing whether Elias would react. But Elias did not look down, did not follow the movement. He kept his attention forward, steady, as though the canteen was already back in his hand even when it was not. And then, without asking permission from anyone, he stepped past them, closing the distance back to the woman who had not moved from where she knelt, her hands resting loosely in her lap now, her breathing calmer, her eyes no longer searching but observing. And there was something different in the way she watched him this time. Not gratitude, not fear, something quieter, something that measured. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she would not have to reach, far enough that he did not crowd her space, and he lifted the canteen again, unscrewing the cap with a small twist that sounded louder than it should have in the silence that followed. And though it held only the faintest amount of water now, barely enough to wet the bottom, he extended it anyway, the gesture unchanged, the intention intact. And for a second the entire town seemed to hold its breath, not because of what he was offering, but because of what he was refusing to become. And when she reached for it again, slower this time, her fingers steady despite the exhaustion that still lingered in her frame, the air shifted in a way no one there could name, like something unseen had taken note, like the land itself had marked the moment and decided it would not be forgotten, not by the wind, not by the dust, and certainly not by those who would soon have to stand in it. The last drop never reached the ground this time, not because there was more water left in the canteen, but because the way she lifted it, careful and steady, carried a kind of weight that made even the men behind Elias hesitate without understanding why. And when the rim touched her lips, she did not drink immediately. She paused as if listening to something far beyond the edges of Red Hollow. Something carried on the same dry wind that pushed dust across the street and whispered through the gaps between buildings, and Elias saw it then. The smallest shift in her posture, the way her shoulders settled not into weakness, but into something closer to control, like a person remembering who they were rather than who they had appeared to be only minutes before. The men noticed it too, though none of them would have admitted it, not out loud, not in front of each other. Because admitting it would mean accepting that what stood in front of them was no longer just a stranger passing through. And so they filled the silence again the only way they knew how, with voices that tried to reclaim ground they felt slipping beneath their boots. "That is enough of this," someone said, louder now, stepping forward with the kind of certainty that comes when a man believes numbers are the same as truth, and a few others followed, forming a loose line that was more habit than strategy, as if standing together made them something stronger than they were alone. And Elias did not step back, did not shift his weight. He remained where he was, not blocking them, not challenging them, simply existing in the space they now had to choose to cross. The woman lowered the canteen then, her grip firm, her eyes lifting from the leather to the faces ahead, and there was no gratitude in that look, no plea, only a quiet recognition that passed over each of them one by one, as if she was memorizing something they could not yet see. And for a moment even the loudest among them faltered, just a fraction, just enough to let the wind speak again through the street. Elias reached out slowly, not to take the canteen back, but to steady it as her hand trembled once. A brief, human motion that reminded anyone watching that whatever else she was, she had been pushed to the edge of her strength, and she let him touch it, did not pull away, did not flinch. And that small allowance said more than anything either of them could have spoken. "You are making this worse for yourself," another voice called out, sharper now, edged with the kind of warning meant to sound like concern, and Elias finally turned his head slightly, not enough to fully face them, just enough to acknowledge that he had heard, his expression unchanged, his eyes carrying the same quiet distance that had made him an outsider long before this day. And when he spoke again, it was softer, almost lost beneath the shifting dust. "It is already decided." No one answered that, because no one there knew what he meant, not yet, and that was the part that unsettled them most. The woman rose then, slowly, not with the unsteady movement of someone barely able to stand, but with a controlled motion that drew a thin line between who she had seemed to be and who she truly was, her height straightening, her shoulders lifting as though the weight she carried had shifted from her body to something else entirely, and she held the canteen close for a moment before, extending it back toward Elias, not as a return, but as a gesture that completed something invisible between them. And when he took it, their fingers brushed briefly, not in urgency, not in hesitation, but in agreement, silent and understood. And as she stepped past him, moving toward the open edge of town without looking back, the air behind her felt different, like a door had been left open to something that did not belong to Red Hollow, something vast and patient, something that had been watching long before any of them had chosen their place in this moment. And now, for the first time, it was beginning to move. No one tried to stop her as she walked, not because they chose to let her go, but because something in the way she moved made the idea of stopping her feel misplaced, like reaching out to grab the wind and expecting it to stay. And the space she left behind seemed to widen with each step, stretching the silence across the street until even the smallest sound carried farther than it should have. The creak of a sign swinging on its hinge, the soft scrape of boots shifting in dust, the quiet exhale of a town that did not yet realize it had crossed a line it could not step back from. Elias watched her until she passed the last building, until the outline of her figure softened against the pale horizon, and only then did he lower his hand, the canteen still resting in his grip, lighter now, but heavier in a way that had nothing to do with water. And when he turned back toward the men, their expressions had changed, not softened, not hardened, just unsettled, like something familiar had slipped just out of reach and left them unsure of where to stand without it. "You should have let her go thirsty," one of them muttered, quieter now, as if the words did not carry the same certainty they had only moments before, and Elias did not answer, did not offer them anything to push against, because there was nothing left to argue, not here, not now, and that absence of resistance lingered longer than any defiance could have. He stepped past them without hurry, moving toward the trough where the last of the spilled water had already disappeared into the dry ground, leaving only a darker patch that would fade before the sun dropped below the ridge. And he knelt there, setting the canteen down beside him, unscrewing the cap once more as if the act itself mattered more than what remained inside, tilting it slightly to see if even a drop had been spared. But there was nothing, only the faint smell of leather and dust, and he closed it again with a small twist that echoed in the quiet. Behind him, the men shifted, their voices low, uncertain, the kind of murmuring that builds when people try to reassure each other that nothing has changed, that everything is still the same as it was before, and yet none of them moved to leave. None of them turned away from the street or from Elias, as though something held them there, something they could not name, but could not ignore either. The light began to change then, slow and steady, the golden edge of late afternoon stretching across the buildings and turning the dust into something softer, almost calm, and with it came a breeze that did not belong to the heat of the day, cooler, carrying with it a scent that was not from Red Hollow, not from the wood or the iron or the animals tied along the posts, something cleaner, something older. And Elias lifted his head slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of a shift he had felt before in other places, in other times, when the land itself seemed to breathe differently for a moment. Far beyond the edge of town, too distant for most to notice, a faint line appeared along the horizon, so thin it could have been mistaken for a trick of the light, a distortion where the earth met the sky, and no one pointed it out, no one called attention to it, but more than one pair of eyes drifted in that direction without knowing why, drawn by something that moved too slowly to be seen and yet too steadily to be ignored. Elias rose from the ground then, brushing the dust from his hands, slipping the canteen back to his side where it rested against his hip, and he did not look toward the horizon again, did not follow the line as it grew just slightly darker, just slightly wider, because whatever was coming did not need to be watched to arrive. It only needed time, and time, out here, always kept its promises. The line on the horizon did not rush, did not announce itself with noise or urgency. It simply grew, slow and steady, the way a storm builds beyond sight before a man ever feels the first drop. And as the light continued to fade, that thin mark became something more defined, something with shape, something that moved with a rhythm too even to belong to wind or dust alone. And one by one, without speaking, the men in the street began to notice, their voices trailing off, their words losing purpose as their attention drifted outward toward the open land they had always believed they understood. It started as a feeling more than a sound, a faint vibration beneath the ground, subtle enough that a distracted man might miss it. But out here no one was truly distracted, not when the land shifted in ways that did not match the hour, and Elias felt it through the soles of his boots, a steady pulse, distant but certain, like something large moving with intention rather than chance. And he did not turn immediately, did not need to, because the direction of it was clear long before the details came into view. Behind him, someone finally spoke again, but the confidence was gone now, replaced by something thinner, something closer to a question that no one wanted to ask out loud. "You see that?" the man said, not pointing, not needing to, and another answered without taking his eyes off the horizon. "Probably just riders passing through." Though even he did not sound convinced, because riders did not move like that, not in that number, not with that kind of quiet weight that pressed against the air itself. The line darkened further, separating into shapes, then into motion, and the first glint of reflected light caught the last of the sun, not sharp, not flashing, just enough to mark presence, to say something was there and had always been coming. And a low sound followed it, carried across the distance, not loud, not chaotic, just the steady, measured rhythm of hooves striking earth in unison, too controlled to be random, too many to ignore. Elias shifted his stance slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just grounding himself in place as if the exact spot where he stood mattered more now than it had minutes before, and his hand rested lightly against the canteen at his side, not gripping it, not drawing attention to it, just there, the same way it had been when he first held it out, unchanged in purpose even as everything else began to change around him. The men who had stood so close before began to spread without realizing it, creating space between each other as if distance might offer clarity. But it did not. It only made the silence louder, and one of them took a step toward the edge of the street, then stopped, uncertain whether moving closer or staying back made more sense, because there were no rules for this, not the kind they were used to, not the kind they could enforce with words and numbers. The shapes grew larger, more defined now. Horses, many of them, moving together with a calm that carried more weight than any rush ever could, their heads aligned, their pace even, and behind them figures sat tall in the saddles, not leaning forward, not urging speed, just guiding what was already decided, and the dust that rose around them did not scatter wildly. It lifted in a slow, rolling cloud that seemed to follow rather than lead, as if even the land itself chose to move with them, instead of against them. No one in Red Hollow spoke now, not because they were told to be quiet, but because something had entered the space that made noise feel unnecessary. And as the first of the riders reached the edge of the valley, still a good half-mile out, but close enough that no one could mistake what they were seeing, a single thought settled over the town without needing to be shared. This was not a passing group. This was not chance. This was something that had been set in motion long before the water touched the ground, and now, it had arrived exactly where it intended to be. The riders did not slow as they entered the valley, and that was the first thing that unsettled the town the most. Not their number, not their silence, but the certainty in their pace. The way they moved as if no one in Red Hollow had the authority to stop them, as if the ground itself had already given permission long before any man there had the chance to consider it, and the sound of hooves, once distant and uncertain, now filled the air with a steady rhythm that did not rise or fall, did not threaten, did not hesitate. It simply existed, constant and measured, like a heartbeat too large to belong to any one man. Dust rolled behind them in long, low waves, not chaotic, not wild, but controlled in a way that suggested discipline rather than urgency. And as they drew closer, the details became clearer, the lines of their figures, the calm set of their shoulders, the way their hands rested without tension, not reaching, not preparing, just present, and the horses beneath them moved the same way, not driven, not strained, but guided. Each step placed with purpose, each breath steady in the cooling air of late afternoon. Elias did not move from where he stood, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, but there was a weight in the silence around him now that had not been there before, something that pressed against the edges of every thought in the street, something that made even the smallest movement feel like it carried consequence. And behind him, the men who had spoken so easily before now found themselves without words, their earlier certainty fading into something they could not name, something closer to recognition than fear, though none of them would have admitted it. One of them stepped back, just a single pace, as if adjusting his footing, but the motion spread, subtle and quiet, until space opened between them all, not out of agreement, but out of instinct, the kind that rises when a man realizes he is no longer the one setting the terms of what happens next. The riders reached the edge of town without breaking formation, without raising their voices, without signaling anything at all, and then, as if guided by a single thought shared among them, they stopped, not abruptly, not sharply, but in one smooth motion that brought the entire line to stillness at once. The sound of hooves fading into silence, so complete it felt louder than the rhythm that came before it. For a moment, nothing moved, not the riders, not the townsmen, not even the dust that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, and in that stillness, the scale of what stood before Red Hollow settled into place. Not as a threat, not as a display, but as a presence that did not need to explain itself to be understood. Then, from somewhere within the line, a single rider moved forward, not fast, not slow, just enough to separate from the rest, and though the distance still held between them and the town, every eye followed that motion without thinking, drawn to it the way a compass needle finds its direction without being told. Elias felt it then, not surprise, not relief, but confirmation, something quiet and certain that settled into him the same way the first shift in the wind had earlier, and his hand brushed lightly against the canteen at his side, not as a reminder, not as a question, but as something complete, something that had already done what it was meant to do, long before the first rider had ever appeared on the horizon. The rider who stepped forward did not carry himself like a man arriving to confront or to prove anything. He moved with the kind of quiet certainty that made distance feel smaller, without ever closing it too fast, his horse advancing a few yards at a time before settling, as if even the animal understood that this moment did not belong to speed, and behind him the rest remained still, not shifting, not adjusting, holding their place with a discipline that spoke louder than any raised voice ever could. The space between him and the town stretched wide, maybe 50 yards, maybe more, but no one needed to measure it, because what filled that space was not emptiness, it was tension, not sharp, not violent, but heavy, like air before a storm that chooses not to break. Elias stood where he had been, not stepping forward to meet the rider, not stepping back to avoid him, simply present, and for a brief moment it felt as though the two of them were the only ones in the valley, the rest fading into the edges of the scene like figures that had lost their place in a story they no longer controlled. The rider stopped at last, his horse lowering its head slightly, breath steady, and he looked across the distance without narrowing his eyes, without searching, as if he already knew exactly where to look, and then his gaze settled, not on the men who had gathered in the street, not on the buildings, or the trough, or the fading patch of damp earth, but on Elias. No one spoke. Not the rider, not the townsman, not even Elias, because whatever needed to be said had already passed between them in a language that did not use words, a recognition carried in stillness rather than sound, and the longer it held, the more it pressed against the others, until one of the men behind Elias shifted again, clearing his throat as if to remind himself that he still had a voice to use. "You have no business here," he called out, louder than necessary, the words echoing slightly against the wooden fronts of the buildings, but they landed with less weight than he intended, thinning as they crossed the open space and reached the rider without effect. The rider did not react, did not turn his head, did not acknowledge the voice at all, and that absence of response carried more meaning than any reply could have, because it made clear, without saying so, that the terms of this moment did not belong to the man who had spoken. Another man took a step forward then, emboldened by the sound of his own breath, but he stopped short of the open ground, his foot hovering for a fraction of a second before settling back, as though something unseen marked the boundary he was not willing to cross, and behind him the others remained where they were, no longer forming a line, no longer standing together. Just a group of individuals caught in the same realization at slightly different times. Elias finally moved, but only enough to shift his weight, his hand resting once more against the canteen at his side, his fingers brushing the worn leather in a motion so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way the rider's gaze flickered, just once, toward that movement, not with curiosity, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if that single object carried a meaning that extended beyond the town, beyond the moment, something that had been understood long before either of them stood where they did now. The wind passed through the street again, cooler than before, carrying with it the same faint scent that had arrived earlier, and for a brief second it felt as though the valley itself was listening, waiting, holding its breath along. With every man standing there, because whatever came next would not be decided by force or numbers or words, it would be decided by something quieter, something already set in motion the moment water had been offered and refused, the moment a choice had been made and witnessed, and now, with the rider's eyes steady on Elias and the town held in a silence it did not know how to break, that choice was beginning to take its final shape. The rider did not raise his voice, did not lift a hand, did not give any signal that a man might expect when something this large arrived at the edge of a town, and yet something shifted the moment he exhaled, slow and measured, as if the air itself carried a message the others could not hear, but could not ignore either. And then, without looking away from Elias, he inclined his head just slightly, not a bow, not a gesture of submission, but something older, something that acknowledged a choice, rather than a man. Behind him, the line of riders responded, not with movement at first, but with stillness that deepened, as if the entire formation settled into place more firmly than before, and then, one by one, almost too slowly to notice at first, they dismounted, not in haste, not in unison, but with a quiet coordination that needed no command, boots touching ground with soft, controlled steps, reins held loose, horses remaining calm as though they had done this many times before in places far from Red Hollow. The sound of leather and dust was the only thing that marked the shift, no voices, no orders, just presence, expanding outward without crossing into the town, holding the line as clearly as if it had been drawn in the earth. The men of Red Hollow watched without understanding what they were seeing, because nothing in it matched the kind of confrontation they had prepared themselves for. There was no rush forward, no raised hands, no attempt to take anything or prove anything. And that absence began to press against them harder than any threat could have, because it left them with nothing to push against, nothing to resist, nothing to justify the way they had stood only hours before. The rider who had stepped forward remained mounted, the only one who had not dismounted, and after a moment, he turned his head slightly, just enough to look past Elias, past the men, past the buildings, toward the place where the last of the sunlight still touched the edge of the valley. And from that direction she came, not quickly, not slowly, simply at a pace that matched the silence that had already taken hold of everything. Iana stepped into view as though she had always been there, as though the distance she had walked earlier had only been a pause rather than a departure, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and as she approached the rider, he shifted his position just enough to give her the space that belonged to her, not by force, not by obligation, but by something understood long before this day began. She did not look at the men who had stood in the street, did not seek them out, did not measure them or judge them, because whatever she needed to know about them had already been seen, already been decided, and instead she looked only once toward Elias, a brief, quiet glance that carried no demand, no expectation, just recognition, the same kind he had offered without words when he had held out the canteen. Then she turned her attention forward, toward the open space between the riders and the town, and for a moment it seemed as though everything waited for her to speak, for her to give a signal, for her to decide what this presence would become, and the weight of that moment settled over Red Hollow in a way no one there had ever felt before, because it was not held by men who shouted or commanded. It was held by someone who did neither, someone who understood that power did not need to announce itself to be real. She lifted her hand then, not high, not dramatic, just enough to be seen by those who were already watching her, and the movement was simple, almost small, but it carried through the line of riders like a ripple through still water, and in that single motion, without a word spoken, without a single step taken toward the town, the meaning of everything that had happened that day settled into place with a clarity that could not be argued, could not be undone, because it did not belong to them anymore. It belonged to her, and to the choice she was about to make. Her hand did not stay raised for long, just a brief moment suspended in the quiet, and then it lowered again, slow and certain, like the closing of a door no one else had realized was open. And with that single motion the riders responded, not with force, not with movement toward the town, but with something far more unsettling. They turned, not all at once, not sharply, but in a smooth, deliberate shift that carried through the entire line like a shared breath, and one by one, they began to step back toward the open land they had come from, their horses following without resistance, their formation holding even as it reversed, as if the ground behind them was calling them home rather than the town before them calling them forward. No one in Red Hollow spoke, because there was nothing left to say, not after understanding settled in, not after realizing that whatever judgment had been brought to their doorstep had already been decided, and it was not the kind that left marks on the body or demanded anything in return. It was the kind that stayed, the kind that changed how a man stood in his own shadow long after the dust had settled. Ayana remained where she was for a moment longer, watching the riders as they moved away, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and then she turned, not toward the town, not toward the men who had filled the street earlier, but toward Elias, and she took a few steps in his direction, closing the distance just enough that her voice, when it came, did not need to rise above the quiet. "You gave what was yours," she said, the words simple, spoken in careful English that carried both distance and clarity, and there was no praise in them, no debt being declared, just a statement, something placed between them like the canteen had been, something that did not ask for acknowledgement to be real. Elias did not answer right away, not because he did not understand, but because he did, and understanding out here was not something that needed to be spoken every time it appeared, so he gave the smallest nod, not to her, not to anyone watching, but to the moment itself, and that was enough. She reached out then, not for his hand, not for anything from him, but for the canteen at his side, and he let it go without hesitation, placing it in her hand as easily as he had offered it before, and for a second she held it, turning it slightly as if weighing something unseen, before she set it down gently on the edge of the trough, upright, steady, no longer empty, though no one there had seen it filled, and that quiet impossibility passed through the crowd like a thought no one wanted to claim. Then she stepped back, not lingering, not waiting for a response, and turned to follow the riders, her figure moving toward the horizon where the last of the light stretched thin across the valley, and as she walked, the space she left behind felt different, not wider, not emptier, but settled, like something that had been out of place had finally been returned. The riders continued on without looking back, their numbers fading into the distance the same way they had appeared, not rushed, not hidden, just gone when the land decided it was time, and soon the sound of hooves softened, then disappeared entirely, leaving only the wind to move through Red Hollow once more. Elias remained where he was, his gaze following the horizon for a moment longer before dropping back to the trough, to the canteen now resting there, quiet and still, and he reached for it, not to check it, not to question it, but simply to take it back, his fingers wrapping around the worn leather in the same way they always had, unchanged, and as he turned away, walking back toward the edge of town where his path led out into the open land. No one stopped him, no one called after him, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to prove. And long after he was gone, long after the dust had settled and the light had faded, the people of Red Hollow stood a little quieter, spoke a little softer, and when they looked at the empty stretch of land beyond their buildings, they no longer saw it as something they owned, but as something that remembered, something that had watched, and something that, when the time came, had chosen not to take anything at all.